Recording back on. Before we dive into today's program, I just wanted to flag a few housekeeping notes. As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded. We'll be together for about the next 90 minutes. And then, as we said, the recording will be edited and shared more broadly so that others can take a look at this and dive into the discussion. We've also enabled the live transcription service. So if you, for those joining us live, you should be able to access that by clicking the CC transcription button in the Zoom window. And for those watching the recording, you should also be able to access the closed captioning. And then also attendees today are more than welcome to add questions to the Q&A box throughout the session. We are having a fun technical day so far, but we're going to get through it. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of the discussion of the background and the context in which we are together today, and then really looking forward to introducing my esteemed colleagues and panelists here today and really diving into the discussion that we're going to have in just a moment. So this event, Doing Data-Driven Democracy Right, is part of a series organized by the GovLab, the Asia Foundation, the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia to inform more purpose-driven and impactful use and reuse of data to improve governance. Specifically, our organizations collaborated on the governance domain of the 100 Questions Initiative, a global participatory effort to identify the 10 most impactful questions related to governance that could be answered through targeted data analysis, stewardship, and collaboration. The 100 Questions methodology starts from the premise that the use of data is often misaligned with societal needs and opportunities. And rather than being purpose-driven, tends to be based on the data that happens to be accessible or easily at hand. And across 7 domains, including governance, but also areas like migration, the future of work, air quality, and others, the GovLab and partners focus on a particular problem area or domain, convene a global community of bilinguals. In this sense, we mean individuals with both domain area expertise and data science expertise, ask these expert bilinguals to identify what questions relevant to the domain they feel would be most impactful if answered. And importantly, making sure that those questions are ones that could be answered if the right data, information, and capacity were brought to the table. After a multi-stage refinement and prioritization process, we published the bilinguals' co-created list of 10 questions for public voting and prioritization. This process of expert sourcing and validation, followed by further input and prioritization from the public, then informs our efforts to match the prioritized questions with data assets and capacity that could help to spur progress, all toward operationalizing new data collaboratives and new data-driven initiatives that could help us derive answers to these questions and put those answers into practice to improve governance and improve people's lives. The bilinguals participating in the governance domain, as you can see on the slide here, spanned a number of sectors, regions, disciplinary backgrounds, and substantive focus areas. And we always move toward or prioritize this kind of broad diversity in the interest of soliciting broad expert input on the many dimensions and wrinkles associated with a topic as tricky as governance. So the bilinguals have now had their say and created their list of 10 priority governance questions that they feel could potentially be answered through data and data collaboration and data stewardship, and that would be majorly impactful in the public if we were to derive the answers to these questions. So very briefly, the questions that the bilinguals identified were: first, what is the relationship between transparency and public trust in government institutions? Second, which groups are included and excluded in data used for formal government decision-making? Third, if citizens have greater access to data, does that mobilize them to take action and engage politically? Fourth, how are social media and digital communications platforms affecting the nature and quality of political debate? Fifth, what are the key factors contributing to effective civic engagement at national and local levels? Next, does open governance lead to more inclusive, transparent, and timely decision-making? How can democracies achieve inclusion more effectively in terms of both process and in terms of outcomes? How does the level of social accountability affect the quality of public service delivery? Which factors play the biggest role in determining differences in institutional capacity and performance of government agencies? And finally, how has democratic regression affected public service delivery? Now, it's important to note that you can find more information on each question, including a detailed rationale and a relevant background and context on the 100 Questions website and platform beyond just the question itself. And now that the bilinguals have had their say, we turn to the public to help us further prioritize this list and inform the data-driven democracy efforts that would be well positioned for a positive impact stemming from this effort. So the voting platform is open and available at governance.the100questions.org. So we encourage folks to visit the site and make your voice heard, and also perhaps to keep the page open during this discussion, since we will reference and reflect on some of these questions over the next just under 90 minutes. So this discussion today, and I can stop sharing my screen and we can see the panelists' faces, which is probably a bit more interesting than my PDF there. So on the occasion of the public voting campaign launch for the governance domain, the GovLab, TAF, BRAC, and CSIS are hosting a series of regional panel discussions with data and governance experts. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's session focused on doing data-driven democracy right in the Americas. And now that you've heard more than enough from me, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed panel and bring them into the conversation. So first, we're delighted to have Renata Avila, the CEO of the Open Knowledge Foundation. Renata is an international lawyer, author, and advocate who brings nearly 20 years of experience in access to knowledge, freedom of expression, policymaking, and global digital rights. Renata is an affiliate with the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, part of the World Economic Forum Expert Network on Digital Technologies, and a member of the Global Board of Trustees of Digital Future Society, among many, many other affiliations. So thanks so much and welcome, Renata.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And then next we have Rosario Pavese, the Senior Regional Coordinator for the Americas at the Open Government Partnership. Rosario is a political scientist and open government activist who has worked on democracy strengthening and development for the past 13 years, particularly focusing on the open government agenda. Since 2017, she has provided guidance and assistance to civil society organizations and governments across South America, supporting the development and implementation of open government reforms. Prior to joining OGP, Rosario worked for the Buenos Aires city government, promoting openness and transparency through different projects and initiatives. Thanks so much and welcome, Rosario.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation.
Finally, last but not least, we have Silvana Fumega, the director of the Global Data Barometer project, as well as the research and policy director at ILDA. She holds a PhD from the University of Tasmania in Australia. She also holds a master's degree in public policy from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, and a degree in political science from the University of Buenos Aires. She has served as a consultant for several international organizations, governments, and civil society groups with a recent focus on the intersection of data and inclusion. Thanks so much and welcome, Silvana.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. So now that we all know who's on the call and who our expert panel is and some of the context here, really excited to dive in to some of these tricky questions in terms of how we can better use data to improve governance in a number of different ways, especially thinking about it from the regional perspective. So to kick us off, I wanted to pose a question to each of you. So as we just discussed, the 100 Questions methodology surfaced 10 priority questions in the broad field of governance that could potentially be answered through more effective and participatory use of data. So I'm interested from all of you in some of your reflections on what role does data play in this type of governance decision-making? And why should we ultimately care about more effective use of data to improve governance? And we can go, if it's okay, in the order of how we introduce. So I'll kick it over to you, Renata, first.
Okay, it reminded me school, when I was at school, I was Avila. Avila was always the first one to answer, like it would be like the same here. It would be Avila for Mega and Pavese, but anyway, I wish, I wanted to speak from my experience in Guatemala, in Central America. And what I would say is that what has been like the characteristic of the national government and local governments is improvisation, nepotism to a great extent, improvisation, nepotism, going by the feeling of what people would like rather what people would need, and complete invisibility of many things that are like obvious to everybody. And the important thing of data governance is that sometimes data, not sometimes, most of the time data, when you curate a good data set, makes visible the invisible, or makes factual the assumption. And in that sense, I think of a very specific topic, for example, that it is land ownership, for example. When we often hear in Guatemala, oh, they are poor because they want it, because they don't work hard enough. The poor are poor because they are lazy. Lots of assumptions that are not based in facts and not based in data. And when you look at the data, for example, if we are an agriculture society and all the data, all the land ownership is owned by very few people and the others do not have access to it. And then you add data on the daily, like intake of calories, for example, and you add data on access to water, or access to electricity, and the multiple inequalities the data can make visible, you realize, okay, is it really that they do not want to work? It is really that they want everything easy, or they're objective facts blocking for people the ability to even survive, with a minimum vital. I think that deliberately, so how can it help to good governance? I think that it is the way, the more that we institutionalize this data, especially if a country is a member of the international community, the better accountability that we have. Maybe it's not something only local, I understand the hard circumstances that people in my country face, with a corrupt state and weak state. But when that data is directed to international indicators, that helps shed light on why the things are so bad in some countries, or whether the things are improving or not. And I think that in the circumstances of Central America, data, good data, accurate data by autonomous entities producing it can lead to international accountability and can lead to better regional policies. Perhaps, with the data of all these good data of all these circumstances, the multilateral system will behave differently to issues like migration, to exceptions and waivers on the free trade agreements, to more cooperation targeting specific populations. And without that, we are just basing our policies with anecdotes, with whatever the person in power tells the others, and with whatever the press that is really suppressed in Guatemala reports about. So that's my initial intervention, and I'm talking where I am at the moment from that perspective, which is, as you said at the introduction, the Americas is a very diverse space, and Central America has a specific characteristics of high inequality, low literacy, extreme poverty that made it different from the southern cone or the Andean countries. So it's my first intervention.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Renata. And I think exactly a big part of why we wanted to host these discussions is to start to drill down, because these more global questions obviously have many different wrinkles and considerations that need to be taken into account when operationalizing them in different regions. And then a region is still a pretty broad area. So how do we continue to drill down into something that would be actionable and impactful, and really appreciate those points on visibility, especially as it relates to data and how important that can be. So next up, going down the alphabet, and see, I was a Y growing up, so I was always very happy to be in the back of the class and go last. But next up, we'll go to Silvana with the same question. The role of data in governance decision-making, and why should we care ultimately?
I was waiting to be the last one, and suddenly the alphabet is ruining the order, but I'm happy to go now. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to the GovLab, to you, Andrew, Stefan. I'm really happy to be here with great colleagues and friends. So I want to reflect a little bit on what we are doing at the Global Data Barometer. I know that is probably not that specific to the region. I have other questions to reply specific to the regions, but mostly I want to say a few words about that, because we are concerned about some of the questions and about use that you mentioned here. So that's the reason I wanted to provide a bit of background. First of all, I mean, we are now launching the first edition of the Global Data Barometer after almost a decade since the launch of the Open Data Barometer. And why we are doing that? Mainly because even though public data has been more accessible in the last decade, we don't really know how well it is deployed as a resource for tackling social challenges, enabling collaboration, driving innovation, and improving accountability. In a sense, we don't know exactly how to answer the question that you are posing these days. So without that, without new benchmarks, we are losing track of the key data gender-related issues that affect policymaking and innovation. Therefore, this new Global Data Barometer aims to better track the extent to which data is governed, shared, and used. So in this context, the GDB has been designed to respond to some of the new issues that we are asking ourselves these days, and that are more complex than the ones that we were asking probably a decade ago. So this global benchmark is looking at issues through 4 pillars: governance, capabilities, availabilities, and use and impact. So that's the reason I wanted to provide a few lines of background on the project. All those pillars are fed by indicators coming from 2 core modules, assessing data governance and capability throughout a country, and thematic modules. These thematic modules look into sectorial data ecosystem, for example, line, like Renata mentioned, political integrity, company information, public procurement, and so on. So one of these pillars, as I mentioned, is use and impact. And we are concerned about the same thing that you are presented in these questions. So some of the questions that we are using to capture a little bit about the use and impact of the data globally, because I forgot to mention, we are covering more than 100 countries around the world in this edition. And some of the questions that we are trying to test, because remember that this is a pilot edition, so we are trying to figure out how to better get to answer some of the questions that you are posing here. So in terms of the indicators, in terms of use that are included in our expert survey, there are questions regarding, for example, about the data or the use of the data, the open company data to support due diligence. In terms of land data, as Renata mentioned before, to try to check if there's evidence that land data is being used to influence policy in the interest of equitable and inclusive land tenure and use. So I think that's pretty relatable to what it was mentioned before. Also, in terms of political integrity, how political integrity data, or if political integrity data has been used to identify, expose, or highlight failures of government. Procurement data as well, in terms of evidence of government procurement data being analyzed to improve procurement practices. So in a way, we are trying to capture many of the questions. I mean, this is a global question, but we are thinking about how to go into thematic questions to try to capture the use of this data. We are using as well secondary data. We are using in particular the dimension 1.5 from the statistical performance indicator of the World Bank Group that that is related to the data used by international organizations. So with all that, we are trying to see how to better capture the use and impact that data is creating at the global scale. Some preliminary results of this pilot edition, we are still working on reviewing the data, but I have some ideas that I want to share with you, is that there is a correlation between availability, governance, and use. However, the use and impact pillar still ranks pretty low for all countries. In this particular one, I'm not making difference between different countries, but it's low for everybody for all the countries involved. In spite of that, what we've seen is there are some examples coming from data use, in particular in land, in low and lower middle income countries, and these exercises are mostly supported by multilateral organizations. What we are asking ourselves, and I think that's something that we want to ask as well, together with the question that you're posing today, is how to transfer those capabilities to local users, how to improve the local ecosystems to provide sustainability in terms of capability, but also infrastructure to make the most of the data. So in a way, I'm not gonna give you any particular answer, but I'm gonna add questions to your question. And in a sense, from this global exercise, we know we are still really far from having all the answers, in particular because this type of global comparable measurements are still pretty difficult, and there are many things to explore on how to better analyze and understand use of data. And one thing that is pending, and I think is pretty important here, is how to better capture the use of data inside the public sector for decision making. In this type of exercises and many others, in general, we can track some external uses, from civil society, academia, journalists, but there's still plenty of gaps in terms of how to measure the internal use of data. In the meantime, we are putting the spotlight on uses, particular, I think, that the best way to approach these things so far are study cases that could help us to better understand the use and the results they produce, and what are the foundations to escalate that use. And hopefully with all that, the results coming in February, we can provide more insights into this. But I want to say that it's still pretty difficult to answer these questions. Some of the main ways to try to answer those questions are study cases, because global exercises, we are still far from being able to compare the use and the impact of this data. But there's a lot to be learned and to be done. And hopefully in the next year, with the things that we learn from this pilot edition and with this type of conversations, we are gonna be able to improve a little bit more and to get closer to understand how data is used inside and out of governments.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Silva. So many things that we could dig into on that, to be sure, but I want to kick it over to Rosario for your initial thoughts on why we should care about the use of data for governance, and then we'll dive into some of the many topics that have already been put on the table. But eager to get your thoughts to start us off, Rosario.
Thank you, Andrew. The problem of being the last one is that the most interesting things have been said. So I think we are all here because we understand that there's much more data can give to the decision-making process. And I have had many questions these years in the context of the pandemic on how better we could have reacted as a region if we had shared databases, if we had standardized concepts on data related to health, to contracting, to many aspects that really influenced how the pandemic developed, and that could have saved us many bad decisions that most of our countries have made in different situations. So I think my answer would be there's much more we can do with data to make evidence-based decisions. But we all know that for data to be transformative, it has to generate social, political, and economic value. And I think that it seems simple, but it's a great question on how we can better articulate civil society and governments to achieve this social value. And probably today, the challenge we have is not about availability of data. In some cases it is, but on how efficiently we can use it, or what we are using it, and we are articulating around that data. We have seen these past months that some of the best analysis on pandemic data, for example, come from civil society. Citizens and civil society have been faster in adapting to the necessities of an ongoing crisis, producing a faster and better results and information that, of course, has been used and reused by governments to make decisions. But the governments are not being able themselves to adapt quickly and use that data for their own benefits and for the decision-making process. I think most governments are still very slow in articulating within the public administration. Most ministries still function as isolated organisms, and that definitely affects the attempt of using data strategically, because we know that in complex problems, the richness of using that data comes from crossing and articulating many different indicators related to social, educational aspects, economical. So if we still have owners of that data within governments, that's a big issue we need to solve to have a better evidence decision process. And of course, one aspect that worries me in all these months that we have been through is that even though we might think that data is aseptic, we can discuss that too, but decision making is not. So we cannot have a data decision making process without a human rights approach. And I think that we have been seeing a trend these last years, a growing trend of populism and authoritarianism in some parts of our region, which gives me even more questions, because how populists tend to believe they have the answers. They don't need to consult data. They don't need to open up participatory process to discuss what's the necessity or where, how that policies should be. So how do we work in the region with this growing trend of populism, in this necessity of opening better data, sharing it and articulating it within the governments and in the region too? And why should we care? Well, we are all believers in the power of data and open government to improve people's lives and our democracy. But I would say that because it's not using data for public policies, it's not the intelligent thing to do. We know, we have evidence that we can be more efficient, that we can be more sustainable in our policies when we use data. And because it's also more expensive not to use this data for public policies. We end up spending much more money doing a poor use of the budgets in poor policies if we don't use data to elaborate them. So I would say these are some thoughts, but as Silvana said, I have much more questions than answers in this field.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much, Rosario. And I think that point on data responsibility as a responsibility both to avoid misuse of data as well as misuse of data when it can provide value is really a core premise that informs a lot of our work at GovLab, and I think is really important in this governance context as well. Not just how can we guard against inappropriate uses of data for governance, but also make sure that we're harnessing the value. And that's neither of those is an easy proposition, to be sure. but this has already been such a rich and cross-cutting conversation, but I have some specific questions for each of you, but I'm also happy for if anyone wants to pick up anything that's already been put on the table and go down that route. Happy to take this wherever you all want to take it. But for Renata, I'm eager to get your thoughts building on what's just been discussed around what are some of the gaps or the deficits that are slowing progress toward more effective use of data for policy, whether they be issues around knowledge deficits. You already, Silvana already mentioned the question of infrastructure and ecosystems and human capital. And are there any notable efforts at Open Knowledge or elsewhere where you've seen some of those deficits being addressed in a useful way that could be replicated elsewhere?
Well, there's, like if I speak from the Central American perspective, there's a multiple deficiencies. One, I will say that our governments and local governments are not really producing data. They do not consider yet data as key infrastructure building block for a good policy. And most of the data is held not even by universities, but by the private sector. And it's privatized by having the public interest data completely privatized and inaccessible for even the most well-intentioned policymakers. Is very little room to do things, and with some generosity and case-by-case basis, some of the companies open the data sets, but not all, and the crucial data is in private hands and locked. And it's locked not because of local policies, but it is because of a sophisticated system of global policies that, that gives certain privileges for the private sector to have proprietary data by default. And I think about agriculture, data about the soil, data about traffic, data about consumption, like very important data sets that are not accessible to universities and to organizations working in the public interest. That's one, that's the first. So first problem is lack of a culture that recognizes data as a key infrastructure. The second is precarity. Like austerity measures have been imposed in Central American governments since the late 90s, when we transit from armed conflicts to peace. Not only all the key social services were privatized, but the government has very little resources. So even if there's willingness, having a basic data infrastructure is expensive. At the Open Knowledge Foundation, we try to transfer these skills and this ability with the SICAN project and with the frictionless data project. But even those, you need at least a little budget and at least a person who's fully tasked to work on this. And many times it is the sysadmin, the sysadmin dealing with everything at the municipality, and on top of that, trying to set up, an open data portal and chasing everybody and navigating a mess of PDFs and like a messy system of data capture that is all over the place, and then begging those companies that the municipality or the local government signed contracts with to give a little bit of the data, and the data is like outdated. It's a mess. And so if we do not think, if there's no budget for it, if there's no institutionalized political will to treat data as a key infrastructure, as we, I mean, it's a bad example, the highways, because here are like full of holes, but if we consider it like something crucial, then the culture will shift. But there's no demand, like from civil society, except from very specific cases. And cases that are like where the abuse is so obvious and where the data is so out there that people are using it to enforce. I guess that one of the examples is the feminicides examples, the crimes against women example in Guatemala. The other example where data was I think that was my first exposure to big data in a very scary way was the pattern of genocide committed in Guatemala, where you will see, like, a pattern of massacres of a specific population in a specific geographical area. And things like, like localized violence or localized famine. I think that one of the most, one of the biggest gaps in the region, and one of the most urgent priorities will be to have some digital sovereignty, even some autonomy, like led by universities and so on geographical data and geospatial data. Because if we think of the region, the specific reality of the region and the multiple conflicts, most of the conflicts are related to land issues, to mining issues, of the natural resources issues. And so I think that since Central America will be one of the regions most affected by climate change, if I would think of top priority of data that we need is geographical data, and then very specific data sets that will enable, even without the government, for civil society organizations to act as a region and have modeling and predictions on what's going on there. In that sense, with Open Knowledge Foundation, we are like prioritizing climate crisis data and prioritizing social inequalities data as our like key components, because if we want to provide something to the world, we need to focus. And the focus seems right now to tackle the most urgent issues. One is social inequality, and the other is the climate crisis that then drive migration and violence and many other issues. So at the moment, we are putting our tools and designing new tools to put at the service of people in government and civil society to produce the data sets that will enable us that will unlock the power of data for the people.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Renata, for that really important and nuanced kind of perspective, and really appreciate the specific focus on what's happening in Central America and Guatemala specifically as a real important way to ground this conversation and think about how these questions impact people's lives in a very real and tangible way. So next on some of these questions about responsibility and ethics and inclusion that have already been raised, eager to turn back to you, Silvana, for some thoughts on your perspective on some of the concerns related to data responsibility, data ethics, inclusion, bias, and other data rights issues, as has already been raised briefly. How have those conversations and those narratives and those very real realities impacted the use of data to inform governance, and which actors and policies or other interventions have been particularly influential in that regard, and have they been effective? So an easy question, over to you.
Really easy. What I have like 1 minute? Yeah, I'm gonna solve everything in 1 minute. No, but more seriously, when we are talking about data ethics, I mean, we are talking about assessing data practices with the potential to impact people and society directly or indirectly. And I'd like to share a few thoughts coming from our work with data, in particular in ILDA, in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have done research projects, community support, or even policy and standard design. And in all the work in all that work, we work under one premise, that is, in the information age, we have data, and with that data, we can make decisions and nurture public policies that are based on this reality captured by the data. I mean, all the things that we were asking before and we were talking about in the first questions, we are working with that premise. The problem is that this premise has certain flaws. The data does not usually count all people and all contexts. So in this sense, if we don't use the right categories to understand why we are collecting data, we won't collect the right data. And without that data, designing policies that offer solutions to diverse groups of people, and even more broadly to promote social change, is going to be incredibly difficult. So this gives us a clear idea of what happens when we discount certain people or groups in our data choices. So it shows why we need to be accountable and think about inclusion and ethics when we are talking about data production and publication. And this idea is very present in our work at the national, regional, or global level. For example, we work with violence against LGBTQ people in Central America, standardization of data on feminicide, research on migration, women in contracting, and the reflections that we did on how we build the standards in an inclusive manner, just to put a few examples. From our work on the standardization of data on feminicide, I mean, one of the things that was pretty clear is that if there's no clear data on a set of aspects that can characterize these events, we could be omitting certain crimes from the records, and that means that we are neglecting to consider these victims when designing and implementing policies and other measures. What we are doing when we are trying to implement standardization processes is force organizations to think about what type of data they need, how they collect it, how they store it, and eventually how they publish it to use it. What I want to emphasize is that even though, I mean, our work in feminicide, we think is pretty important and is valid for that phenomenon, when we are thinking about structured data, we are thinking that it's a necessary condition, but of course it's not sufficient to solve the problems. However, if we don't really understand the problems we are facing, it's going to be pretty difficult to think about how to solve them, as I mentioned before. Another example that I could mention as well, when we are talking about invisibility and exclusion of people from official statistics, relates to the project on violence against LGBTQ people in Central America. This is important as in official statistics, the data collected and disseminated still refers in most cases to binary sex categories. So that leaves many populations invisible and underrepresented in our data. The cause of that is that we are ignoring the experiences of many individuals who don't conform to these two categories. So if we don't think outside these categories, if we don't broaden our approach, we will keep looking at the world in a binary way, and we will avoid to capture the fact that people and their realities are much more complex than that. Also, I think Renata mentioned that before, data on migration. I mean, in general, is another population that in many cases is out of the official statistics and data. I'm not talking about people coming in and out, but thinking about how they live, what they need. In many cases, when we are talking about certain groups of migration, they are completely out of the data and the record. So in that sense, they are completely out of the public policies and the solutions that we can think to improve the way they are living. To sum up, I mean, we as a society must be aware of the implications of the data we produce and consume. It affects the information we take into account to understand politics, to understand which benefits we are entitled to, and whether certain opportunities arise just because we belong to a certain demographic. We are still learning how to deal and mitigate prejudice. There is still a long way to go. As in the previous question, in both cases, I'm saying the same thing, but the good thing is that we are talking about this, we are asking this question, so we are closer to get some kind of solution. This is the first step. I mean, becoming more aware is the first step to think about how we can solve that in the future. One other thing that I also like to mention is that from the work on feminicide, I mean, not only the standardization, but also one of the projects that is Data Against Feminicide that we are working with Data Plus Feminism from MIT and Feminicide Uruguay, is that there is a need for integrating gender perspective and inclusion lenses within the public sector. I mean, what we are learning from all this work is that not all actors working, for example, on feminicide are familiar with relevant gender perspective, meaning that actors within the judiciary or the security forces need training to collect the necessary data that is important later to establish whether a given murder constitute a femicide or not. I mean, they are the ones in most cases getting first to the crime or collecting the first data that cannot be recovered if you don't do that at the beginning. The same thing with the judiciary. If you don't try to prove that a femicide is such or not, I mean, with the right tools. I mean, it's difficult that you can do that, and it's difficult that you can visualize this type of crimes. A few points just to end here. Data is necessary, but we really know that it's not enough. But without that, we don't know the problems or the reality that we are facing. So systematization efforts contribute to seeing the problem and capture them in its complexity. Also, it is important to be reminded that what is not counted is not seen. And if it's not seen, it's very difficult to act on it, with whether it's public policies or any other tool. I mean, we need to know what we are facing to later think about how to solve it. Lastly, training on gender and inclusion approaches is necessary for people who work on issues of public interest, from violence to any other social problem that is affecting our society. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to include all people in our data. And without that, it's going to be pretty difficult to think about solutions and to think about policies that include all society and not just a group of them.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Silvana. And so much that we could get into on all of those issues. But I think that the point, especially on gender being a dimension of all of these questions, I think certainly resonates with our experience in the 100 Questions Initiative. And one of the ways that we organized it actually was to think about how do we bring that gender lens to questions of the future of work or questions of air quality, because even though we did have a gender domain, ultimately those questions are so cross-cutting and come into play in so many different areas. So having that understanding and real focus on how to take those issues into account, no matter what kind of the specific topic area happens to be, I think is certainly resonates with our experience and thinking as well. But now we've already talked a lot about actors across sectors, but Rosario, I'm interested to get a sense from you on how you see non-government players, especially nonprofits, watchdog organizations, citizen groups, community-based organizations, and other players. How are they influencing the way that governments use data, or how could they more effectively influence the way that governments use data?
I think we have seen civil society has been determinant in influencing all the open data and open government development that we have had so far. And particularly the open data community in Latin America is likely very vibrant and challenging. And they are used to going for more and demanding more to the governments. We have seen a huge effort from civil society in promoting this type of commitments in OGP action plans. From the total of OGP commitments all over the world, 20% focus on or include a very strong component of open data. And this is very important because one of the bases of OGP is that these commitments need to come from an agreement and a cooperation from civil society and the governmental actors. And we have seen some trends here and even a transformation on which actors participated in this kind of open data commitments. The first trend was between 2011, when OGP was launched, and 2014, where we could find some open data commitments which aim more at general objectives, frequently linked to creating like the bases that were needed or the infrastructure to open data, the creation of web portals or even repositories, or even the establishment of national open data policies which didn't exist in the region so far. But this trend changed in 2015. I think in parallel with the open data and open gov community growth and development, we started seeing, we learned a lot, and we started to be more precise and accurate on what we needed and how we wanted to move forward with the open data strategies. So since that year, we are seeing more commitments aimed at opening data for specific purposes or thematic areas. And this has led also to widening the audience and the type of actors also non-governmental actors that get engaged in this type of commitments. We also now find more commitments oriented at promoting the participation of specific groups, new audiences with specific needs and interests, which can be focused on health, education, environment, as both Silvana and Renata mentioned. And this also implies an evolution on the actors who participate, and also the challenges that it brings. It's not the same for a civil society organization, which mission is to open up data to promote a policy like this, rather to a group, for example, a group of rural women who need to promote a specific policy and want to benefit from the use of data. So this also imposes some challenges for all of us to try to find new ways on how to use this data and to take it to this group. I think both in the open government and in the open data field, we need somehow to go beyond opening nice participation spaces, but where we expect people to come, and rather identify mechanism dynamics where we go to the people and we take the data and the participatory opportunities to these non-governmental actors who sometimes find it very difficult to participate in these traditional open government spaces. So I would say that we open data commitments are coming in the new action plans, and they have been transformed and evolutionated. We still face this challenge on how we get to articulate governmental institutions within the same open data policy, which I think is a challenge for most of the countries in the region, but also how we generate these participatory spaces for civil society that are sustained not only in the co-creation of these policies, but also in the monitoring and in the implementation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rosario. All incredibly important and useful points. Before we open it up, and we already have a few questions that have come through in the chat, but before we open it up to the Q&A, I did want to get one final question over to each of you, which is going back to the impetus for this conversation, which is the launch of the 10 priority questions for governance coming out of the 100 Questions Initiative. I'm eager to learn from you all. If we as a society could wave our magic wand and suddenly have the answer to one of these questions, which of them would you choose, and how would you suggest actually going about putting that answer into practice? So which is the one that jumps out at you as, if we would have this answer, life would be immediately significantly better, whether in the particular domain that you focus on or more generally across society? I don't want to pick on Renata first again, so why don't we reverse the order this time? Rosario, if you're game to jump in first. Fantastic.
Well, I might be biased, but I think that does open governance lead to more inclusive, transparent, and timely decision making is a key question for us, for the ones who work in this open government field. Because of course we believe that what we do is the right thing and that we are doing it with a purpose, but all the evidence that supports that idea, it's very helpful for us, especially to try to convince the skeptics. What worries me a little bit, and it's a fear I want to share with you, is what would happen if we don't like the answers of some of these questions, which worries me a little bit about participatory processes, transparency, and public trust. And because what we're seeing with democracy right now is it's confusing. And so personally, I'm super curious and a bit worried on what we might find out with these questions, but eager to see.
Okay, I can go. And
I love.
Yeah. I just know that it's me now. I haven't thought, or at least I wasn't prepared about what Rosario just mentioned, and I think it's a very important thing to think about. I mean, what happens if when we know the answer is not what we are assuming in the first place, and that's something to keep in mind. I mean, again, the question that I'm going to pick, of course, is bias as well, because of all the work that we've done in ILDA with inclusion and so on. So for me, it's going to be the one about who is including or not, or who is excluded in our data. Because again, I think what is not counted is not seen and it's difficult to act on it. But what get me thinking after listening to Rosario is what happens if we are including people in data and that provides them not with benefits, but the other way around. And that's something that we need to take into account, not only the benefits, but the risks as well that might take or people might be if they're including our data. So we have to be very aware, especially because in general, we are talking about marginalized populations. So thinking about how that could affect these groups is really important. And so not only including them, I think that's the first step, but also including them with the respect and the knowledge that we need to be, pretty aware of the things that we do with the data. And in that sense, I mean, because previously you mentioned gender, but I think it's much more than that. I mean, gender is a key aspect in our data, but it has to be inclusion. And in that sense, what I like to mention is that, for example, at the Global Data Barometer, we are including like a general question at the beginning of the survey, the expert survey. And so we ask researchers to identify patterns of marginalization in their country, because we think that even though marginalization occurs around the world, the specifics vary within each country. So we are doing that to try to learn a bit more about who is it people that we are in general excluding from our data. So in that sense, I mean, again, I think it's important to think about inclusion, gender being one of the aspects that we need to include, but it's much more than that. And again, now I'm worried, and I want to stress the fact that it's not only including them in the data, but it's also thinking how we use that data. I mean, for the people that are excluded now, or everybody that is included already, and that we need to be respectful and careful about the things that we do with the data. It could be decision-making, it could be anything that from benefits to harm. So we need to be very careful, but in general, thinking about who is excluded and how we include them in our data, because that means that we are going to include them in our decisions and most importantly, in public policy making.
Fantastic. Thanks, Silvana. Renata, it's all yours.
Yeah, I know. Now I realize that disadvantage of being the last one, because the good ones were already picked by Rosario and Silvana, and I didn't want to be repetitive. You know, by reading all the questions, in total honesty, we cannot address one like individually. We cannot pick one because it's all so interrelated. But I tend to agree that, you know, like the inclusion and exclusion in the data sets is fundamental. If we see data as and public interest data as the data we are like discussing here on decision-making data, is the building block of the AI systems of the future. And if we get it wrong here, we are going to get wrong what comes next and what comes next. And I think that would be like a priority in my case, but it is not like, you know, that which groups are included and excluded data goes hand in hand with how can we achieve inclusion, because it's not only being included in a data set that is captured by somebody, but that data being meaningful for the people and people having a say in the data governance. And I think that one of the examples that is very, very interesting that I can mention here is all the achievements and all the progress made by indigenous communities in their data governance innovation. And I think that I would really like, you know, like it's fascinating. I had an experience, and it was actually an experience that is, it was small data and specific data sets And it was something that we did around 18 years ago with indigenous communities here in Guatemala. And what we were doing, it was very basic, pre, internet of social media times. What we were doing was like with balloons and with cameras trying to map territory. And then with the people trying to map what is in your community, like number of clinics, number of, local health experts, indigenous health experts, number of shops, who's producing the carrots, who's producing the, who's growing the chicken. And the interesting thing is that then we took the data that was made by the community, and the community decided, like, the way that they wanted, that very basic data sets that were like, on paper back then, to the horror of my friends, like, oh my God, the data on paper, like, pen and like not digitized. And we try to contrast that with the official data of the INCOVI, which is the national, national survey on the conditions of life. And the data gathered by the community was so different, by the indigenous community was so different from the data captured by the National Statistics Agency. And I think that even if it was pre-digital, pre-big data, pre-AI era, I think that I would like to, like, and it is related to so many of the things here, have this data sovereignty by people, by collecting the data sets, deciding the way that those will be used, and not without the need of being super high tech, being like, agents of the data futures by understanding that contrasting the data gathered by the community with the official data will lead to possible, like, re-examining of policies applying in a region, or the methods by which the government is talking to the populations. I mean, many of the people doing the service, for example, were like not even able to speak the language, or too lazy to go to the remote village on top of the mountain to capture the data. That's one example. And the second example, and I think this one of the top question, transparency and public trust in government institutions. I think that one hot example is elections, and having electoral data quick enough in a good enough format so it can be, like, contrasted and tested and challenged by all political actors in any given country. What we have seen in the region recently is like super tight elections where, like, like 1,000 votes can make the difference. And what I have seen in the side of our authorities is total incompetence or reluctancy to really release, to standardize as a region, standardize electoral data so it is open and available and quickly released. And the failure to do so has meant like such a decline in trust in elections and in electoral systems that it would be like at the top of my priorities, because if we lose elections, we lose democracy. If we lose trust in elections, we lose democracy. And it would be like, yeah, in my mind and in the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to prioritize what is the data that is like, the data sets that could mean social chaos or rebuilding, and distributing the verification of, distributing the accountability across so many actors, so the institution can be like trusted in the digital age. So electoral data, health data is, and I would say something like natural resources data that are like so important for the public interest and for peace in society, that it should be like priorities for our work.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that. There you are. So I lost my Zoom window for a moment when stopping my screen share, but it sounds like we should prioritize quite a lot, and we have a lot of work to do, I would say, is one of the big messages coming out of this. But I think that as a field, it sounds like we're starting to make some progress toward hopefully getting some insight into some of these issues. And just because it's come up a few times, and I'm eager to dig in a little bit, I'm going to somewhat abuse my moderator privileges to ask one more follow-up question to the group related to this issue of data visibility versus invisibility, and this question of increased disaggregation of data. And specifically thinking about, we've discussed a lot the value proposition of not being data invisible, of being represented in data sets that inform public policy and other kind of governance interventions. But one of the questions that I'm always interested in exploring is this question of how do we move toward data visibility with communities that might have a value proposition for remaining data invisible. And the reason that I raised that was some of our work associated with the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City last year. We had a lot of discussions around certain communities here in New York and how they see the potential value and some of the potential concerns around better reuse of data to address the pandemic in various ways. And one of the things that immediately came out was, well, in some cases, you're talking about communities that would love to be represented in data that's informing decision-making, but also that's a pretty tricky proposition to be, represented in these institutional data sets, whether they're undocumented immigrants or other folks that might have some reason that, especially given the regime in power at the time, might have reasons not to want to be captured in that way. So interested if anyone has any quick reflections on that question of visibility versus invisibility, disaggregation versus aggregation, and how those tensions might arise.
Just pretty quickly, because that's something that that of course was part of the research when we were talking about migration specifically, because we have, as you mentioned, a lot of data of certain migrants coming in and out of certain countries. But when you go to certain populations that they don't have the legal status to be in a certain country, that's where the problems started to become important in terms of how to make them visible, but without putting them in danger. So what we were trying to do is to try to analyze how to standardize certain data points without identifying them. There are certain things that we need to know in terms of making their life better, their quality of life, but we don't need to know exactly who they are. Those are two different things. Protect their identity, but also know for example, how schools in certain areas are, where are they, if they need to, improve certain public services or so on. They don't need to be identified as which is that particular person, but they need to be identified as a group to improve the services and the public delivery of certain services like education, health, and so on, to make their life better. But of course, there's a lot of dangers there. So we need to be very careful, and we need to be very aware of how to protect these populations and their data while making their problems visible. Not them, but their problems and their way of living and the things they need, but not exposing them to any more danger that they already have.
I can go. So I will shuffle again. I think that something very important is to cross-sectoral literacies. I think that the people working in data need to understand more about society and politics. And I think that people working in politics, our representatives need to gain data literacy. At the Open Knowledge Foundation, we have the School of Data, and it's going to be relaunched very soon with more more general, it is not only bringing the data literacies to different sectors, but it is also understanding just these intersections, as Silvana was saying, we need to be very aware on, it's not data for the sake of data, and it's not openness because open is good, because it is good. we need to understand with responsibility the consequences of openness. And we need to rethink openness and pair it with fairness and pair it with responsibility as well. And with the responsibilities that we have, especially to the most vulnerable in societies. So, and that will be like the new vision, you know, like I think that the open movement learned in the last 10 years, very important lessons and of care, of inclusion, of responsibility, of colonial practices that we were like implementing without being aware of. And it is time to, but openness was never as important as it is now, from vaccines to medical data to data about saving the planet. So it is a moment of rebalancing. It is a moment of reskilling. It is a moment of unlearning and relearning. And it is a moment of revamping the movement and launching it to higher levels.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you, for those thoughts. I think it's a really interesting and tricky point. And we're running up toward the end of time. So I see 2 questions in particular in the chat, and attendees, please feel free to add any more, but maybe I'll put them both on the table now, and we'll go around and everyone can reflect on one or both, whichever kind of speaks to you most. The first, Renata just touched on it a little bit, is this question from Regina around data literacy. I think we would all probably agree that an informed citizenry is a pretty important prerequisite for good governance. So how should we be thinking about data literacy training for students and others? And then the other question comes from Jesus around question on whether the panel is aware of any initiatives that use behavioral science to better understand open data use and reuse by citizens, but also public serving organizations, and especially with a focus on incentives. So 2, again, easy questions, but if one or both that you'd like to reflect on, or any other final remarks based on this, again, really rich and compelling conversation, I'm happy to hear those as well. So I'm going to not point at anyone this time and instead ask for a volunteer just to completely change things up. So
I can say that
like to reflect?
A quick comment, because I think probably Renata knows more about capacity building. I mean, in terms of the program that they are launching again, School of Data and so on. But what came to my mind when reading the question and when you were saying that is that in the future, hopefully, everybody understand how to deal with data, how to manage data, how to get benefits from it. But in the meantime, I think it's pretty unfair or not really rational or realistic, more than rational, thinking that right now everybody knows how to use data or build new things or add value to that. So in the meantime, I think it's really important the role of intermediaries, whatever you want to call it, but academia, journalists, NGOs, the better and stronger that ecosystem is, the better value that different people can have through data, but probably they don't know how to use it, but they can have the value that is added to that data. And the more mixed and heterogeneous that our ecosystem is, the better, because we are going to have different perspectives and different uses for that data. And again, I mean, when we are thinking about, for example, the data that we are going to be publishing in terms of the GDP, is just, I mean, probably is the final output from our project, but we are thinking that as the fair input from many other projects and many other things that wants to be built over that, on top of that, the same thing that we are thinking when data is published and is used. And again, I mean, we can't really expect that everybody in society right now is dealing with data. Hopefully in the future they are, but we need to also support intermediaries working and making the most of it right now.
Wonderful, thanks, Ivana. Who wants to go next on these 2 easy questions?
Well, on the Yes, on the literacies, I will say that it is important also to keep an eye on our communities and not fall into the jargon trap and into like the creating our own bubbles of the preaching to the convinced. When I was working at the Web Foundation and we were discussing things like access to the internet and affordability, you know, we approach in Africa, we did something in Africa very cool with ladies, like empowering women in local markets, like, you know, in the fresh food markets, and explaining the issue and having a conversation with them about the issue. And the interesting thing, and then with public radio, and the interesting thing is that we learn more than probably they learned about the issue. I think that creating unusual alliances and cross-pollination of sectors is key, but we also need a multilateral agenda. I think that we have a very good ally with UNESCO. We have a very good ally with the World Bank. And we are increasingly having allies in social movements. I think that the pandemic was a wake-up call for the data we need and why data is very relevant for this. And I think that it is not enough to make, like, you know, trainings available. It is important to engage it as a political issue and as a key component on all our strategies. And it is a little bit learning by doing. And we are like just still, like, you know, like in the very early days, but we must avoid at all costs that the data becomes an issue of the connected and of the privileged accessing superior education. So I think that a lot of work on primary education, on popular education and movement education is needed. And we're ready for that. And we hope that we can, like, you know, draw examples that are relevant for people, and that we are like not obsessed with so much with the, of course I am obsessed because that's what we do at the Open Knowledge Foundation, with the tools and the techniques and the results, but also on I think that we need to go back often to the why are we doing this, and what if we don't do it, and who will do it instead of us, if anyone. So.
Wonderful. Thanks, Renata. Rosario?
Yeah, no, I have so many questions coming related to what you've been saying about data literacy, about privacy, about targeting specific groups, and how it is so urgent for governments and public officers to learn more on how to use the data, but also to learn from civil society. I think that much of this has been done, and there are huge efforts from civil society organizations on toolkits, on training, on education, on literacy, that it could be easily deployed by governments. So I think we do not need to reinvent the wheel there. It's more about finding that synergy between governments and civil society. And I would say especially the media is key in this process. We had a femicide this week in Argentina, and it was the body of this woman was discovered by another woman who called to the police, and she asked to remain anonymous, but she literally said, "I know where she is, who did it, and everything." She was super scared. That phone call was published in the media, in every media yesterday. So that's another woman in danger. That's something we still don't know how to handle. And all the journalists, good journalists, they were publishing that phone call and they were exposing that woman, and they were horrified by the femicide too. So I think at some point we do not understand the risks and the value of the data we handle. And this involves not only governments, but also the media in this process. So I agree, we have a lot to do, but also have a lot of resources in the region that come from the organized civil society.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rosario. And thanks so much to all of you for really driving forward this conversation about how we can leverage data and how we can take a more question-driven approach to improving governance, and especially for all of the reflections that really ground this and make it clear that we aren't talking about questions for the ivory tower or data challenges for data science to noodle over. This is ultimately about people's lives and livelihoods, and we need to get this right. And hopefully we can mobilize all of the different assets and capacity across society to do so. So this has been a really eye-opening and fantastic conversation, and really want to thank you each for all of these interventions. Just to give a quick close and to give folks a sense of what's next in terms of this series and this program, I'm going to briefly bring up the page here. As we mentioned, the public voting campaign for the 10 priority governance questions is now open. So if you go to governance.the100questions.org, you can find the public voting campaign here. There's no need to log on or create any kind of account. You'll be able to just vote directly on the platform. The voting campaign is open through December 31st. So we very much encourage you to log on and give us a sense of what you think will be most impactful and essential to prioritize going forward in this space. We also encourage you to take a look at the 100 Questions website and sign up to stay abreast of new developments and updates on this work and how you could potentially get involved. We're always looking to bring others to the table, whether they be bilinguals, problem owners, those working in the public interest, or folks who have questions that they would like to see answered that could potentially move society forward through the more effective use of data. So always eager to engage with folks that are eager to join on to this effort. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, this discussion is part of a series of webinars hosted by the GovLab, TAF, BRAC, and CSIS Indonesia. We already held the Better Governance Strategies Across Asia's Digital Divide a few weeks back, and that recording and some of the insights are available, and we'll be sure to send that around. And we'll also package that up so that folks can take a look at that. And then hopefully not at the same time as the event that you shared, Rosario, but also on Monday, December 13th, we have the next webinar on building data governance strategies in the EMEA, and happy to share more details on that as well. But that is it from me, unless there are any final thoughts from the esteemed panel here. I think we'll end 2 minutes early, which is, I think, always appreciated. And again, thanks everyone for joining today and for watching the recording after the fact, and especially a huge thank you to our fantastic panel for all of these great insights. So thank you all so much, and stay safe.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.